The knock came at midnight, not the polite kind that announces itself, not the kind that warns you something is coming. This was the knock of desperation. Sudden, urgent, the sound of knuckles against wood that said, "Help me," before any words could follow. Marcus Thorne was already awake. Sleep never held him firmly anymore. Not since the war, not since he'd learned that the night carried its own kind of danger. He stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch outside Silver Peak, Colorado, a massive figure silhouetted against the starlight, and saw her. She was small against the darkness. Smaller still, against the vast emptiness of the high country that surrounded the ranch, like an ocean. Her dress was torn, hanging from her shoulders in tatters. Her face was hidden in shadow, but he could see the way her body trembled, the way her breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. Behind her, the night was silent, the kind of silent that follows violence. Marcus didn't move at first. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements could startle people beyond repair. So he stood there, waiting, his weathered hands hanging at his sides, his grey eyes taking in the details. Blood on her cheek, dirt ground into the fabric of what had once been a respectable dress. Bare feet, cut and bleeding on the cold ground. "They beat me," she said, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the pines. "They beat me for being Apache." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not pity. He was too honest a man for pity. But recognition, the kind of recognition that comes from understanding a particular kind of cruelty. He stepped aside, a gesture so simple it carried the weight of everything he wasn't saying. She hesitated, as if the kindness of that single movement might be a trap, might collapse beneath her if she dared to trust it. "Inside," he said quietly. "Quickly, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The woman's name was Sarah Whitmore, though that name belonged to her white father, to the part of her life that had ended when the mob found her on the trail between towns. She was 23 years old. She had lived in both worlds, the white world through her father's blood, the Apache world through her mother's heart, and in neither place had she found a home. The violence had started 3 days earlier in Silver Peak proper, in the general store where she worked for Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the town's most respectable widow. Sarah had made the mistake of standing too close to a white man's daughter, of looking too directly at her, of existing in a way that reminded Silver Peak of everything it wanted to forget about the frontier's complicated bloodlines. It had begun as whispers. Always it began as whispers, then it had become names, half-breed, savage, abomination, words that stuck to her skin like tar. Then it had become refusal. The townspeople, one by one, stopped coming to the store when she was there. The shopkeeper's wife made a point of supervising Sarah's work, publicly questioning every fold of cloth, every arrangement of goods, making it clear that Sarah's hands were not welcome on respectable merchandise. 3 days of this. 3 days of erosion, of watching solidarity turn to stone around her. Then came the evening she was walking home along the Ridge Road, the high country road that cut between Silver Peak and the smaller settlements beyond. She was alone, as she often was. The loneliness was safer than the company. The riders had appeared like thunder without warning. There were 5 of them, young men with the kind of rage that comes from righteousness, from certainty that they were defending something worth defending. They came on horseback, faces covered with bandanas, carrying torches that turned the twilight into something hellish and red. Sarah had run. She'd run toward the only sanctuary she knew, the open country, the high plains, the direction where she'd heard rumors of a man named Marcus Thorne, a rancher who lived alone on his massive property. A man who'd never shown up to any of the town's organized hatred, who'd simply stayed apart on his land. Asking nothing from Silver Peak and expecting nothing in return, she'd run until her feet bled, run until her dress tore, run until the riders finally gave up or decided they'd done enough, disappearing back toward the town's glowing lights, their work completed. The message sent, the line drawn. And now she stood in Marcus Thorne's kitchen at midnight, and he was lighting a lamp. And the yellow light was revealing things neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge. His kitchen was sparse, clean, the kind of place maintained by someone who didn't expect visitors, who kept order out of habit rather than hope. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a stove that looked well used. On the shelf, a single photograph, a young woman, blonde, smiling, someone who belonged to a part of his life that wasn't visible anywhere else in the ranch house. Marcus moved with deliberate slowness, fetching water, clean cloth, medical supplies that suggested he'd had to tend to wounds before. He set everything on the table and gestured for her to sit. Sarah sat. The movement seemed to cost her something. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, beginning to clean the blood from her face with surprising gentleness for a man with such large hands. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Whitmore." He nodded, working methodically, revealing the damage beneath the dirt. Her left eye was starting to swell. Her cheekbone bore the clear imprint of a fist. There was a cut along her temple that would need stitching. "Half?" he asked, the question hanging between them. "Half Apache, half white." She didn't add anything to this, and he didn't ask for more. "My mother was from the White Mountain tribe. My father was a trader who passed through when I was 3. My mother raised me until I was 10. She died. After that, my father sent for me, brought me to Silver Peak to raise me white." Marcus finished cleaning her face and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were kind, which somehow made everything worse, because kindness was not something Sarah had learned to accept. "You can't stay in town," he said. "It wasn't a question, I know. Where were you going?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Away, anywhere away." Marcus set down the cloth and moved to the stove, where he'd left a pot of water heating. He poured it into a basin and brought it back, along with clean cloth for her to wash her hands and feet. "We have a problem," he said, and there was something almost sad in his voice, a weariness that suggested he'd seen this problem before, had wrestled with it many times in the solitude of his ranch. "If you stay here, people will talk. They'll come. They'll say things I won't be able to stop them from saying." Sarah looked at him, and in her eyes was the flat acceptance of someone who'd already learned the price of existing. "If you stay here," Marcus continued, "we're going to have to be smart about it. We're going to have to give them a different story to tell." "What story?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. Outside, the wind moved through the high country, carrying the smell of sage and pine and the vast emptiness of a land that asked nothing of anyone. Inside, the lamp burned steady, creating an island of light in the darkness. "My wife," he said finally. "I'm going to tell them you're my wife. I'm going to tell them your name is Sarah Thorne, not Whitmore. I'm going to tell them you came from back east, that we were married quietly in Denver, that you're here because this is your home now." Sarah's breath caught. "They won't believe that." "Probably not," Marcus agreed. "But they'll hesitate. Long enough, maybe. Long enough for us to figure out what comes next. Why would you do this?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the photograph on the shelf. He picked it up, and Sarah could see his hands tremble slightly, the only indication that whatever lived behind his calm exterior had real weight, real gravity. "Her name was Eleanor," he said quietly. "My sister. She was half Ute. Our father was white, our mother was Ute, and somewhere between those two bloods, Eleanor became a person this country didn't know what to do with." He set the photograph down carefully. She was beautiful and kind and fierce in the way that people are when they're fighting to exist in a place that's determined not to let them. He turned back to Sarah. They didn't beat her with fists. They beat her with words. But the result was the same. She couldn't stay anywhere. She couldn't belong anywhere. And one winter, about 15 years ago, she stopped trying. The silence that followed was the silence of a story that had no good ending, of a wound that time had scarred over but never quite healed. "I promised myself then," Marcus continued, "that if I ever saw that same look in someone else's eyes, I would do something about it. I would stop standing apart. I would stop pretending I could maintain my neutrality while people like Eleanor were being erased. He walked back to the table where Sarah sat, and he extended his hand. "So, yes," he said, "you can stay, and we'll make them believe it. We'll make them believe whatever we need to make them believe. Because you deserve to exist, Sarah, just as you are, with all of you, all the parts of you that don't fit neatly into their categories. You deserve that." Sarah looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she reached out and took it. The grip was firm, real, not a performance. In that moment, neither of them knew what they were starting. They only knew that the night had changed everything, that a knock at midnight had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and that somewhere in the darkness outside, Silver Peak was still writing the story they were both about to enter. In the high country above the town, the wind howled through the pines, indifferent to human drama, indifferent to the small acts of courage that were unfolding in a kitchen lit by a single lamp. But inside that kitchen something had shifted. The rules had changed, and Marcus Thorne, a man who'd spent 15 years standing apart, had finally stepped back into the world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning light came through the windows, like an accusation. Sarah woke on the narrow bed in the ranch house's spare room, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the wooden floor. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was. Then memory rushed back. The knock, the blood, the man with kind eyes who'd made a promise she didn't know if she could believe. Her body ached in ways that suggested the violence had been thorough. Her left eye had swollen shut completely during the night. When she touched her ribs, pain shot through her like lightning. She sat up slowly, testing each movement, cataloging the damage the way animals do in the wild, assessing whether they can still run if they need to. A knock came at the door. Cautious, patient. "Come in," Sarah called, and Marcus appeared with a tray. Bread, butter, honey, water, and a cup of strong coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since before dawn. He set it on the small table beside the bed and studied her face without looking away, the way doctors do when they're reading injuries. "Ribs?" he asked. "Bruised, I think. Not broken," he nodded once. "I have laudanum if you need it." "For the pain, no." She didn't explain the refusal. They both understood that clarity was more important than comfort right now. "What time is it?" 7 in the morning. "I've already been to town." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Already? Why?" Marcus sat down in the chair beside the bed, this large man folding himself carefully into a space too small for his frame. He held a piece of paper in his hand, worn and creased, as though he'd been carrying it for a while. "I went to the courthouse," he said. "I filed for a marriage license. For both of us, Sarah Thorne. The paperwork is dated from 3 weeks ago, back in Denver. I told the clerk my wife had just arrived by stagecoach and was recovering from the journey." Sarah stared at him. The audacity of it, the sheer, calculated boldness. He believed you? Why wouldn't he? "I'm a man of property. I've lived here for 20 years without causing trouble. And people believe what they want to believe, especially when it fits the story they've already decided to tell about the world." Marcus unfolded the paper and showed it to her. The marriage license was elaborate, official-looking, complete with forged signatures and dates that placed their wedding well in the past, far enough back that questions would seem suspicious, far enough back that her appearance on his ranch would be explained. "There's a danger to this," Marcus continued, and she appreciated that he didn't soften it with false reassurance. "People will resent the lie. They'll eventually know it's a lie. They'll be angry at both of us for daring to construct a deception so elaborate. But there's also a window of time, a few weeks, maybe a few months, where we have plausible deniability, where they can't touch you without touching me, and I'm not someone they can easily dismiss." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over his land, wide open prairie that seemed to stretch all the way to the edge of the world. "There's also something else you need to understand," he said, his voice steady but carrying weight. I'm going to need you to act the part, not just physically, but emotionally. People are going to watch us together. They're going to look for evidence that this is real. If they see hesitation, if they see performance, they'll know. What do you mean? Sarah asked, though she thought she understood. I mean, you're going to have to let people see me treat you the way a man treats a wife. Not improper, he added quickly, catching something in her expression. Nothing that crosses a line you're not willing to cross. But affection, familiarity, the small gestures that say commitment. Sarah picked up the coffee cup and wrapped her hands around it, drawing warmth from the ceramic. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch waking up, horses moving in the corrals, birds calling from the pine trees, the vast machinery of a working property beginning its daily motion. I don't know how to be your wife, she said quietly. You don't have to know, Marcus replied. You just have to let me decide what that looks like, at least in public. In here, in the ranch house, you can be exactly who you are. But out there, he gestured toward the window, toward the town, toward all the watching eyes. Out there, you have to let them see what they expect to see. The next 3 days were strange, in ways Sarah couldn't quite name. Marcus showed her the ranch, the barns and corrals, the vegetable garden where he grew food to sustain himself, the horses he kept, the 2 hands he employed to help with the larger work. He introduced her to them as his wife, using a tone of voice so matter-of-fact that neither man questioned the story. They tipped their hats respectfully and went back to their work, but it was the small moments that surprised her. The way Marcus began to move around her differently, his large frame suddenly conscious of its size, giving her space, never looming. The way he would place his hand on her back when they walked together, a gesture so ordinary that its ordinariness was what made it powerful. The way he insisted on her eating, on resting, on letting her body begin to heal before she tried to do anything else. On the 4th day, there was a visitor. Sarah saw the horse coming up the long drive and felt her entire body go rigid with fear. But Marcus, who was working in the corral, simply continued what he was doing, as if the approaching rider was an ordinary event. It was the sheriff. His name was Tom Bradley, and he was younger than Sarah expected, perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been weathered by the sun and by responsibility. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, making sure they could see that his movements were unthreatening. Marcus set down his tools and walked to meet him, extending his hand. They shook, and Sarah could see in the gesture that they knew each other, that there was a history between them that wasn't hostile. Marcus, the sheriff said, heard some interesting news in town. Is that so? Marcus's voice was level, unconcerned. Folks are saying you got married. Out of nowhere, your wife just arrived at the ranch. Some of the women thought maybe you'd gone back east to fetch her. Marcus turned toward where Sarah stood, watching from near the porch. He gestured for her to come closer. She did, moving carefully, aware that every step was being observed, that the bruises on her face were telling their own story. When she reached Marcus, he slipped his arm around her waist and pulled her gently against his side. The gesture was so natural it felt like they'd been doing it for years. This is Sarah, he said simply. My wife. She's recovering from the journey, as you can see. The stagecoach was rough. The sheriff's eyes took in the bruises, the swelling, the cuts. Sarah could see him making calculations, drawing conclusions. The journey, huh? He said carefully. That's what some folks were saying. But others were saying they saw Sarah Whitmore running on the Ridge Road 3 nights ago, running like the devil himself was chasing her. And then, the next morning, a group of riders came through town, looking drunk and satisfied, the way men get after they've done something they think is righteous. The silence that followed was the pain that carries weight. Marcus didn't loosen his hold on Sarah. He simply looked at the sheriff with eyes that didn't offer any excuses or apologies. What did you do about that? Marcus asked. What could I do? No witnesses came forward. No one filed a complaint. And now I hear rumors that maybe the girl they were chasing was someone with Apache blood, someone who'd been causing trouble in town. And if that's true, well, some folks think she had it coming. He paused. letting that settle between them. But then I hear she's disappeared. And then I hear you've gotten married to a woman who showed up with bruises that don't quite match what any stagecoach journey could deliver. Sheriff Bradley wasn't stupid. That much was clear. He could see through the lie to the truth beneath it. The question was what he intended to do about it. I don't suppose it matters what you heard, Marcus said calmly. What matters is what you can prove. And what I have is a marriage license, signed and dated, filed legally. What I have is a wife. What you have is rumors and speculation. And unless someone is willing to step forward and charge me with something specific, there's nothing your office can do about it. The sheriff studied Marcus for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to Sarah, and she forced herself to meet his eyes, to let him see whatever he needed to see. You doing this of your own free will? He asked her directly. Yes, she said, and meant it in a way that was both true and untrue. He nodded slowly. Well then, I suppose that's an answer. He mounted his horse and turned it back toward town, but before he rode away, he looked back at Marcus one final time. I don't know exactly what's happening here, he said, but I know it's not legal, even if the paperwork says it is. And I know that what happened to that girl, or to your wife, or whoever she is, wasn't right. But I also know there are limits to what I can do, and there are bigger things in play than I can control. So I'm going to ride back to town and tell folks I found you both here, that you're married, that the story holds. After that, what happens next is on all of you. He left without waiting for a response. That night, Sarah and Marcus sat on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The day's tension had left both of them exhausted in different ways. He knows, Sarah said quietly. He does, Marcus agreed. But he's also choosing not to act on what he knows. That matters more than you might think. Why would he do that? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the light drain from the sky. Because he's seen enough ugliness to know when something has gone beyond the law into the territory of what's right. And because in his own way he's choosing a side. Not entirely openly, but he's choosing. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sounds of the town beginning to settle into evening. Sarah thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone, to have another person stand beside you in front of authority and risk something by doing so. They're still going to come, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Marcus confirmed. The lie buys us time, but it doesn't make them accept what's happening. If anything, it makes them more determined. Because now we're not just protecting someone they see as less than human. We're defying them directly. He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. Are you ready for what that means? Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about the ranch, about the bed with the clean sheets, about coffee in the morning and food that wasn't scarce, about Marcus moving through his day in a way that suggested she was part of it now, woven into the fabric of his existence. No, she said honestly, but I'll do it anyway. Marcus nodded, as if he'd expected exactly that answer. In the distance, the first stars began to appear, small points of light in the vast darkness. And somewhere out in the night, beyond the boundary of the ranch, the people of Silver Peak were beginning to realize that the story they'd tried to end with violence had instead taken on new shape. New meaning, new danger. The lie had been set in motion, and like all powerful lies, it was already becoming something neither of them could fully control. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost normal, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing that could happen. Sarah's bruises faded from purple to yellow to a faint green that could almost be hidden with careful positioning. The swelling in her eye went down. Her ribs stopped screaming every time she breathed. The ranch became less foreign. She learned which horse was temperamental, which fence lines needed constant attention, which of Marcus's routines were immovable as stone, and which were flexible. They fell into patterns that, while constructed, began to feel lived in. Marcus would bring her coffee in the morning. She would prepare the evening meals. They would sit on the porch at dusk and talk about inconsequential things, the weather, the state of the pastures, whether the South well needed cleaning. To anyone watching from a distance, they would have looked like a couple who'd been married for years, worn smooth by time and shared purpose. But the ease was deceptive. It was the calm before, not the calm after. The confrontation came on a Wednesday, disguised as a social call. The women arrived in the early afternoon, 3 of them in a wagon driven by a man Sarah recognized from her time in Silver Peak. Eleanor Pritchard, the widow who'd employed Sarah at the general store. Margaret Wells, a merchant's wife. And Caroline Hess, whose husband owned the saloon, and who was known throughout the town as someone who wielded influence the way a general wields weapons. Marcus was out checking on a section of fence that bordered public land. Sarah was alone in the house, working on mending a shirt with stitches that were still clumsy from lack of practice. When she heard the wagon approach and saw who was arriving, her hands stilled completely. She had a choice. She could hide. She could refuse to answer the door. But she understood, even in that moment of fear, that hiding would confirm everything they suspected. So she set down the mending, smoothed her dress, and answered the knock with a calmness she didn't feel. "Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the particular kind of brightness that masked something harder underneath. "We've come to pay our respects to the new bride. We were all so surprised to hear about Marcus's marriage, especially after all these years of him keeping to himself. They didn't wait for an invitation. They moved into the house like water finding cracks, like they owned the space already and were simply reclaiming what was theirs. Sarah gestured to the chairs and they sat, arranging themselves with the careful precision of people preparing for battle. "You'll have to forgive us," Caroline said, her eyes moving around the room, cataloguing, assessing, judging. "But when we heard Marcus had brought home a wife, we thought we should introduce ourselves, make sure she was being treated properly. Offer whatever assistance a woman in your situation might need." Sarah understood the subtext. They were here to inspect her, to confirm whether the story held up when examined from close range, to determine if she was really Marcus's wife or if she was something else entirely. "That's kind of you," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "Can I offer you tea?" "That would be lovely," Eleanor said, though her eyes suggested that what she wanted wasn't tea at all. Sarah moved to the kitchen and began the familiar motions of preparing tea. As she worked, she could hear them talking in the other room, their voices low but not low enough. "It doesn't make sense," Margaret was saying. "A man doesn't just up and marry someone from back east without anyone knowing about it. And then she arrives looking like she's been through something. The stagecoach journey," Caroline said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "That's what Marcus told the sheriff. But I've taken stagecoaches, Margaret. They don't leave bruises in patterns like knuckles." Eleanor's voice cut through. "What I want to know is who this woman really is, and why Marcus Thorne, a man who's made it his life's work to stay uninvolved in town business, suddenly has the audacity to bring someone into his home and marry her. It's peculiar. It's suspicious." Sarah set the tea down on the table with a steadiness that surprised her. The conversation stopped abruptly when she entered, all 3 women turning to look at her with the practiced innocence of people caught saying exactly what they meant to say. "The stagecoach journey was difficult," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from them. "I'm from back east, as my husband mentioned, Philadelphia. My family is in the railroad business. I met Marcus through business connections, and we were married quietly, because my family didn't approve of his simpler way of life. The lie came surprisingly naturally. She'd been living it for 2 weeks, after all. She knew its shape, its texture, the way it needed to be delivered." "How interesting," Caroline said. "Because I have a cousin who works in Philadelphia. In the railroad business, actually. Perhaps you knew her, Victoria Ashton." It was a trap, carefully baited. Sarah felt the moment snap shut around her. There was no way to confirm knowledge of someone in Philadelphia without revealing gaps in her story. But there was also no way to deny knowing someone without making the entire foundation of the deception look questionable. "The Ashton family is large," Sarah said carefully. "I can't claim to know all of them personally." "How convenient," Margaret murmured. Eleanor leaned forward, and Sarah could see in the older woman's eyes something that looked almost like pity. "The truth is, we know who you are," Eleanor said quietly. "We know you worked in my store. We know you're half Apache. We know you ran from town 3 weeks ago. And we know that Marcus Thorne bought a marriage license to protect you." The words landed like stones. Sarah felt the entire structure of the careful deception crack open, but before she could respond, the front door opened. Marcus stepped inside, and the temperature in the room shifted. He was large enough to make the space seem smaller, but it wasn't his size that changed things. It was the expression on his face, not angry, not defensive, but resolved in a way that suggested he'd been expecting this moment and had already decided how to handle it. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "I wasn't expecting visitors. We were just leaving," Caroline said quickly, standing. The other women rose with her, recognizing that the dynamic had changed fundamentally now that Marcus was present. "No need to rush," Marcus replied, his voice pleasant but carrying an undertone that made clear this wasn't a request. "Since you've come all this way, I'm sure you'd like to understand a few things clearly." He walked to where Sarah sat and placed his hand on her shoulder, not performatively, but with a firmness that said she was anchored to something solid. "My wife is exactly who I say she is," he continued. "She's also exactly who you think she is. Both things are true simultaneously, which I understand might be confusing for people who prefer their stories simple. But the law, which all of us are supposed to respect, recognizes our marriage as legitimate. And what my wife does in her own home on her own land is her own affair and mine, not the town's." Eleanor stood, and Sarah could see something shift in the older woman's expression, not acceptance exactly, but recognition, and what happens when the law decides to look more closely at that marriage license. Eleanor asked. "Then the law will find a legally filed document, signed by a legitimate clerk, dated 3 weeks ago," Marcus replied. "Which is all the law needs. The law doesn't care about the motivations behind a marriage. Mrs. Pritchard, it only cares about the paperwork. This isn't over," Caroline said, and there was genuine anger in her voice now. Anger that they'd been outmaneuvered, that the man they'd expected to fold had instead stood firm. "No," Marcus agreed. "It probably isn't, but this conversation is." He walked them to the door and opened it, a gesture that was polite on the surface but absolute in its meaning. They had to leave. There was no negotiation, no further discussion. When the wagon disappeared down the drive, Marcus closed the door and stood for a moment in the gathering silence. Sarah remained at the table, her hands trembling now that the performance was over. "They'll tell the whole town," she said quietly. "Yes," Marcus confirmed, walking back to where she sat. He pulled out the chair that had been empty and sat down heavily. "They'll tell everyone they know exactly what this is. They'll say we're defying them, that we're staging some kind of rebellion. And they'll be right. Will the sheriff arrest you? For what? Falsifying a marriage license that I have every reason to believe is legitimate. He'd have to prove I knew it was forged, and I can always claim the clerk assured me it was legal." He poured himself tea from the pot. She'd prepared and took a long drink before. Continuing, "What they can't do is touch you now without going through me. And what they can't do is prove the marriage isn't real in any way that matters legally. So we've bought something with this visit, Sarah. We've bought time, and we've forced them to acknowledge that standing against you means standing against me. That's not nothing." But Sarah could hear the worry beneath the words, the understanding that this was only the beginning of something larger. Eleanor's question echoed in the space between them. And what happens when the law decides to look more closely? That night, as Sarah lay in bed unable to sleep, she heard Marcus moving through the house. She found him on the porch, looking out over the land, his silhouette sharp against the starlight. "I've made things harder," she said from the doorway. He turned to face her. No, I've made things harder. I chose this, Sarah. I chose to stand for something instead of standing apart. That was always going to have consequences. You could still send me away. I could, he acknowledged. But I won't, because Eleanor was wrong about one thing. This isn't over, but it's not going to be what they think it's going to be either. He looked back out at the darkness. Tomorrow we go into town. We go to the market. We go to the store. We do everything a married couple does. We do it in front of them. We do it until they stop seeing a defiance and start seeing normal life. We do it until they realize that their anger can't change what we've decided to be. Sarah stepped out onto the porch beside him. The night air was cold, carrying the scent of approaching winter. You really believe that will work? She asked. No, Marcus said honestly. But I believe it's the only way. Running doesn't work. Hiding doesn't work. The only thing that ever works is standing still and refusing to be moved. In the distance, a coyote called out to the darkness, and somewhere in town, the conversations were already beginning. Stories being shaped and reshaped. Narratives being constructed about the giant rancher and his impossible wife. About the line that had been drawn and who stood on which side of it. The first trip into Silver Peak after Eleanor's visit felt like walking into a storm that hadn't broken yet. Marcus had prepared Sarah carefully. They would go in the morning on a Saturday when the market was busy and the town was full. They would move through it together openly, unhurried. They would not avoid anyone. They would not hide. They would simply exist in a space that had decided they shouldn't exist at all. Sarah had worn her best dress, a pale blue fabric that Marcus had purchased from a catalogue ordered specifically for her. She'd pinned her dark hair up carefully, arranged her appearance with deliberate elegance. She understood the message it sent. I belong here. I have a right to be here. My presence is not an apology. They arrived in a wagon pulled by two of Marcus's horses, moving at an easy pace through the main street of Silver Peak. The town was smaller than Sarah remembered from her time working in Eleanor's store. Smaller or perhaps just cheaper looking when viewed from a position of security rather than precarity. The buildings leaned slightly as if tired. The dirt street had ruts deep enough to trap a wheel. But the people stopped what they were doing when they saw Marcus and Sarah arrive. At the market stalls, conversations faltered mid-sentence. At the saloon entrance, men stepped back into shadows. Mrs. Eleanor herself, arranging fabric at the general store window, paused and stared. Caroline Hess emerged from the dress shop, as if drawn by some invisible signal that the spectacle was beginning. Marcus helped Sarah down from the wagon with a gentleness that was neither hurried nor hesitant. He kept his hand on the small of her back as they moved through the market, steering her toward the vegetables first, then the dry goods, moving through the town's commercial heart with the casualness of people who had every right to be there. It was the small boy who first dared to speak. He was perhaps 8 years old, the son of one of the merchants. He pointed at Sarah with the unguarded directness of childhood. "Mama, that's the Apache girl," he said loudly. "The one Papa said was..." His mother jerked him back and away, her face flushing red. But the moment of disruption had created a space, a crack in the facade of pretense. Now people had to actively avoid looking, which made the avoiding itself the loudest statement. Marcus continued shopping, selecting items with deliberate care. He picked up apples, testing their firmness. He examined flour, running it through his fingers. He engaged with the vendors in polite conversation, asking about their families, about the weather, about the state of their businesses. And he referred to Sarah constantly, naturally, as an extension of himself. "My wife prefers this variety of coffee," he'd say. Or "Sarah thinks we should try the early turnips this week." Each reference was a small assertion. "Sarah is here. Sarah is real. Sarah is mine." Not in the way people owned property, but in the way that mattered legally. Socially, in a way that the town's laws recognized, even if the townspeople didn't. But it was at the general store where things escalated beyond simple social friction. Eleanor was standing behind the counter when Marcus and Sarah entered. She looked older than she had at the house visit, worn down by something that had nothing to do with physical labor. "Marcus," she said carefully. "Sarah, welcome. We need supplies," Marcus replied. "Flour, sugar, salt, the usual." Eleanor began gathering items, her movements precise and professional. She was treating them like customers, not like people invading her space. It was a kindness, but a costly one. Sarah could see other people in the store watching Eleanor, judging her for this neutrality, interpreting her politeness as betrayal. Then Caroline appeared from the back of the store. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd made a decision and committed fully to it. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her face, beautiful in the certainty of her power, in the way she wore authority like a garment. "Eleanor," she said, "we need to discuss the committee meeting." Eleanor's hands stilled on the counter. "I don't think this is the appropriate time," Eleanor said quietly. "I think it's exactly the appropriate time," Caroline replied, and her voice had taken on the quality of a knife being sharpened. "We're organizing a petition against certain arrangements that have been made in our town. Arrangements that reflect poorly on Silver Peak's values and character." She turned to look directly at Marcus. "The petition calls for any irregular marriages to be reviewed by a town council before they're recognized as legal. For the protection of our community, you understand." It was brilliant and vicious in equal measure. She wasn't directly attacking Marcus's marriage. She was creating a framework that would make his marriage retroactively illegitimate, that would place the burden of proof on him rather than on them. Marcus set down the flower he'd been holding. "And how many signatures has this petition gathered?" he asked calmly. 32 so far," Caroline said with satisfaction. "More coming daily." "Out of how many people in Silver Peak?" Several hundred, of course." "So roughly 8%, Marcus said. "That's not a community consensus, Miss Hess. That's a faction. And factions don't make law." "No," Caroline agreed. "But they make pressure, and pressure is what changes things." Sarah felt Marcus's hand find hers, felt him squeeze gently. A signal, a reminder. She was not alone in this. "Then let me make something clear," Marcus said, his voice low and steady in a way that made people in the store stop what they were doing to listen. "I don't care about your petition. I don't care about your pressure. My wife and I are legally married. That marriage is recognized by the state of Colorado. If you want to challenge it, you're welcome to take your petition to a court. But I suspect you'll find that no judge is going to overturn a legal marriage based on a town council's discomfort with who I've chosen to marry." He picked up the flower again. "Set it on the counter. Eleanor, how much do we owe you?" Eleanor rang up the items with fingers that trembled slightly. "That will be $3.40. Marcus paid without haggling, then gathered the goods. As he turned to leave, he did something that Sarah wasn't expecting. He offered her his arm, not the small of her back, but his actual arm, in the formal gesture of a man escorting his wife through society. It was a performance, but it was also a statement, clear enough that even Caroline couldn't misinterpret it. They walked out of the store together, and as they moved through the door, Sarah heard Eleanor's voice behind them, speaking to Caroline in a tone she'd never heard before from the older woman. "You've made a mistake," Eleanor said quietly. "Marcus Thorne is not a man who breaks when pressured. He's a man who breaks things that try to break him." The wagon ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than Sarah had known before. It wasn't the silence of fear or anticipation. It was the silence of people who'd survived something and were taking stock of the damage. When they reached the ranch, Marcus unhitched the horses himself, his movements deliberate and slow. Sarah waited on the porch, watching him work. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and released. The physical manifestation of the effort it took to appear unmoved by what had happened. When he finally came to join her, she didn't ask if he was all right. She already knew he wasn't. "She's right," Marcus said, sitting heavily in one of the porch chairs. "Eleanor was right. I can't break what's already broken. But I can refuse to let them break what I've chosen to protect. They're going to keep coming, Sarah said. It wasn't a question, yes. The petition is just the beginning. There will be more visits, more confrontations, more attempts to make us feel unwelcome on land that I own, that I've owned for 20 years. He looked at her directly. I need to know if you want to stay. Because I can't ask you to endure this. I can't protect you from all of it. Sarah thought about the stagecoach ride she'd taken from Philadelphia, a journey she'd never actually made. She thought about the bruises that were finally fading, about the fear that had driven her to knock on a stranger's door in the darkness. She thought about the past few weeks, living a lie that had become more true than any truth she'd known before. I want to stay, she said. Not because I'm brave enough to want to, but because I understand now that there is no place to run to. There's no place in this country where someone like me, with blood from both sides of a line that everyone seems obsessed with, can exist without someone deciding I'm a problem. She paused, gathering the words she needed, so I might as well do it here. Might as well do it with someone who's decided to stand for something instead of standing aside. Marcus reached over and took her hand. The gesture was small, but it was real, not performed for anyone's benefit. Just two people, sitting on a porch at the edge of the frontier, deciding to hold on to each other while the world decided what to make of them. That night, Marcus did something he hadn't done before. He showed her his gun, a Colt revolver that he kept in a locked case in his bedroom. He showed her how to clean it, how to load it, how to aim. He showed her where the ammunition was kept and made her practice until her hands knew the motions without her mind having to direct them. I don't want you to have to use it, he said carefully, but I want you to be able to if it comes to that. You think it will? Sarah asked, her voice steady even though her hands weren't. I think the more successful we are at existing, the more desperate they'll become. I think there's a threshold where words stop working and people decide that violence is justified. I've seen it before, in the war, in the territories. I recognize the signs. He set the gun down on the table between them. So we prepare, not because we expect the worst, but because we've learned enough about human nature to know it's possible. And because being prepared is sometimes what prevents violence, people are less likely to move against you if they think you'll fight back. Sarah picked up the revolver, feeling its weight. It was heavier than she expected, more solid. There was something almost honest about it, unlike words or deceptions or the careful arrangements of society. A gun was just what it was. A tool, an equalizer, a final argument. If it comes to it, she said, I'll fight. Marcus nodded once, as if she'd passed some kind of test. Perhaps she had. November arrived with a bitterness that seemed personal, as if the season itself had decided to ally with Silver Peak's displeasure. The first snow came early, blanketing the high country in white so pure it seemed almost accusatory. Marcus had warned Sarah about Colorado winters, the way they could drop temperatures 50 degrees in a single night, the way storms could cut off the ranch from town for weeks at a time. But warnings are different from experience, and Sarah felt the isolation like a physical presence now, squeezing in from all sides. It had been 3 weeks since the market incident, 3 weeks since Caroline had announced her petition. 3 weeks during which the cold had gradually turned from natural phenomenon into weapon, limiting travel, limiting communication, limiting everyone's ability to move freely through the world. But the isolation was also providing something unexpected, a respite. The work intensified. The ranch had to be prepared for months of weather that would make ordinary tasks impossible. Feed had to be stored. Animals had to be secured. The buildings had to be weatherproofed against the coming onslaught. Marcus worked sunrise to sunset, and Sarah found herself working alongside him in a way that went beyond the performance of being a wife. She learned to mend equipment. She learned to preserve vegetables in ways that would keep them through the winter. She learned which animals needed special attention when temperatures dropped, and how to move through the cold without letting it break you. She became, through necessity and time, less of a guest on the ranch and more of a partner in its operation. And in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat by the fire, something shifted between them that had nothing to do with performance or necessity or the careful construction of a lie. It was quieter than that, more real. It was on the 1st of December that the letter arrived. Marcus rode into Silver Peak to collect supplies and returned with his jaw set tight and an envelope in his saddlebag. He set it on the table without opening it, and Sarah could see in the way he looked at it that he already knew what it would say. "It's from the territorial court," he said finally. "Caroline filed a formal challenge to our marriage. She's demanding that a judge review the legitimacy of our union." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment they'd been anticipating but had somehow convinced themselves might not arrive. "What does that mean?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. "It means we have to go to Denver, to appear before a judge, to prove that our marriage is legal and binding." He opened the letter and read it carefully, his expression hardening with each line. "The hearing is scheduled for January 15th. We have 6 weeks," Sarah sat down heavily. 6 weeks to shore up a lie that had been constructed quickly under pressure, with forgery at its foundation. 6 weeks to prepare for a legal examination that would demand proof of their marriage. Proof that didn't exist. "We can't win this," she said quietly. "When they examine the marriage license, when they check the dates, when they try to verify—" "I know," Marcus interrupted. But his voice didn't carry despair. It carried something else, something like resignation mixed with resolve. "But we're not going to run, and we're not going to pretend this is something it isn't." He walked to the window and looked out at the white landscape beyond. "My sister Eleanor, my real sister. I haven't talked about her much, have I? She spent her entire life trying to make the world believe she fit into categories it had created for her. She tried to be white enough, Apache enough, woman enough, respectable enough. And it killed her, Sarah. The effort of constantly adjusting herself, of constantly apologizing for her own existence." He turned back to face her. "I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to construct a better lie to replace the one we've built. Instead, I'm going to walk into that courtroom, and I'm going to tell the truth. The truth will destroy everything," Sarah said. "It will prove we committed fraud. You could face charges." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "I could. But what I won't face is the slow death of constantly pretending to be something I'm not. What I won't face is watching you do it either." The weeks that followed were strange in their ordinariness. Winter deepened. The snow piled higher. The ranch became more isolated, cut off from town by weather that made travel increasingly difficult. Marcus and Sarah settled into the rhythms of survival, feeding animals, maintaining equipment, preparing food for storage, ensuring that the house could withstand the assault of cold that was coming. And in that isolation, something remarkable happened. The lie stopped mattering. Oh, it was still there. The forged marriage license was still in Marcus's possession, still the official record of their union. But as the weeks passed, and they worked side by side in temperatures that dropped to 20 below, as they saved a calf that got trapped in a snowbank, as they sat by the fire and talked about everything from philosophy to the practical problems of maintaining fences in frozen ground, the distinction between the performance and the reality began to dissolve. Marcus told her stories about his life before. The war, the choices he'd made, the men he'd killed, and the reason it had broken something in him that he was still trying to repair. Sarah told him about Philadelphia, about the mother she barely remembered, about the confusion of growing up between worlds that didn't want to claim her. And somewhere in those conversations, the marriage stopped being a deception and started being something real. It was Eleanor Pritchard who brought the first news of town sentiment when she managed to ride out to the ranch in early January. The elderly woman looked exhausted, as if she'd been carrying something heavy for too long. "Caroline is confident," Eleanor reported, accepting the coffee Sarah offered her. "She's saying the judge will rule in her favor, that the marriage license won't hold up to scrutiny. There's already talk of what will happen after, What they'll do to you when they have legal grounds. What do they want to do? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Banish you, Eleanor said simply. They want you gone from Silver Peak entirely. They want to set a precedent that someone like you, someone from the mountains with Apache blood, can't just suddenly become respectable through marriage to a wealthy man. They see it as an insult. Marcus appeared from the back room, where he'd been working on equipment. You should know I'm planning to tell the judge the truth, he said to Eleanor. About the marriage license. About why we did it. Eleanor's eyes widened. Marcus, no. I know what it will do, he said calmly. It will prove that I knowingly participated in fraud. It will damage my reputation. It might result in legal consequences for me. But it will also make it impossible for them to claim we were trying to hide anything disreputable. We did what we did openly, for reasons we stand behind, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took Marcus's hand. You remind me of your sister, she said softly. She had that same stubbornness, that same refusal to bend to what people wanted from her. Did you know her? Marcus asked, surprised, briefly years ago, before she died. Before the world made her so tired that she couldn't keep fighting. Eleanor paused. I was one of the people who didn't do anything to stop it. I watched her disappear from society, and I went about my business, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. She squeezed Marcus's hand. Don't make my mistake. Don't accept the world's verdict on who you're allowed to love or who you're allowed to save. After Eleanor left, Marcus and Sarah stood on the porch watching her ride back toward town, her figure growing smaller against the white landscape until she disappeared entirely. She's going to change sides, Sarah said quietly. Before the hearing, she's going to speak for us. Maybe, Marcus replied. Or maybe she's just bearing witness. Sometimes that's enough. As January 15th approached, Marcus made preparations that had nothing to do with the legal case. He transferred the deed to the ranch to Sarah, a document that made her the legal owner of the property if anything happened to him. He set up accounts that ensured she would have financial security regardless of the court's decision. I'm not planning to lose, he explained when she questioned these actions. But I'm planning for the possibility that I might. And if I do, I need to know you're protected. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Denver, they didn't sleep. Instead, they sat by the fire and talked about what might come next. Not the worst-case scenario, but the best one. The one where somehow, against all odds, they found a way forward. If we lose, Sarah said, if I have to leave Colorado, we won't lose, Marcus interrupted. But then he corrected himself. That's not true. We might lose, but if we do, you're not leaving alone. Do you understand that? What would you do? Whatever I had to, he said simply. We've already burned bridges here. We've already made the choice to stand for something. We don't get to take that back just because it becomes inconvenient. Sarah reached over and took his hand, and it wasn't a performance, wasn't a gesture designed for anyone's benefit but their own. It was just two people holding on to each other in the darkness before a storm. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called out to the night, a sound that was lonely and fierce and absolutely certain of its own right to exist. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape toward Silver Peak, where people were sleeping soundly, convinced they knew how this story would end, confident that their version of justice would prevail. They didn't understand yet that some people refuse to be erased. Some people refuse to apologize for existing. Some people will walk into fire rather than bow. January 15th was coming. The judge was waiting. The testimony would be given, and everything would either break or hold firm. But on this night, in this house on the edge of the frontier, none of that mattered yet. There was only the fire, the silence, the knowledge that they had made their choice and would see it through to whatever end. Awaited. The stagecoach ride to Denver took 3 days, through terrain that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Sarah watched the landscape shift as they descended from the high country, the snow giving way to brown grass. the isolated ranches becoming more frequent, the small settlements growing larger until finally, the city itself appeared on the horizon like something from a dream she'd never actually had. Denver was nothing like Philadelphia. It was rawer, newer, still in the process of deciding what it would become. The buildings were constructed from hope as much as from wood and stone, each one standing on ground that had been wilderness not so many years before. The streets were wide enough to accommodate wagons and horses, chaotic with activity, full of people who were themselves in transit, trying to become something other than what they'd been before. Marcus had been to Denver before. He moved through the city with the careful attentiveness of someone navigating a place that operated under different rules than the frontier. They stayed at a hotel that Eleanor had recommended, a respectable establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Catherine Fletcher, who asked no questions and seemed to have seen every possible variation of human circumstance in her long career. The night before the hearing, Marcus and Sarah had dinner in their room. The hotel provided food on trays brought by quietly efficient servants, and they ate in silence, neither of them having much appetite for conversation. Tomorrow, the judge would examine the marriage license. Tomorrow, the deception would either hold or collapse. Tomorrow, their future would be determined by a stranger in a courtroom who had never been to Silver Peak, had never known Eleanor, had never seen the look in Sarah's eyes when she'd knocked on Marcus's door, half dead from violence. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said as they sat by the window overlooking Denver's main street. "Something I haven't told anyone." Sarah turned to face him. "The war broke something in me," he continued. "I told you that before, but I didn't tell you what. I didn't tell you that I killed men, and that I knew they were going to die before they died, and that I didn't always stop it from happening." He was quiet for a moment, gathering words that were clearly difficult for him. There was one man, a captain. He was ordering executions of people he considered enemy combatants, but they were mostly civilians, women, children. "I saw what was about to happen, and I should have shot him. I should have stopped it, but I hesitated. I hesitated for maybe 5 seconds. And in that 5 seconds, he gave the order. And by the time I acted, it was too late to change anything." Marcus turned away from the window to face her directly. "My sister never recovered from that information. When I told her, when I confessed what I'd failed to do, she asked me why I was still alive if I could let that happen. And I didn't have an answer then. I don't have a good answer now." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked quietly. "Because tomorrow I'm going to stand in front of a judge and tell the truth about the marriage license, about the fraud, about why I did it. And I'm going to do that knowing it might destroy everything I've built. And I'm doing it anyway. Because the cost of another lie, the cost of adding this to the weight I'm already carrying, would break something else." He paused. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand that this isn't nobility. This isn't me being brave. This is me being desperate to stop accumulating reasons why I shouldn't still be alive." Sarah crossed the distance between them and took his face in her hands, a gesture of such tenderness that it surprised them both. "You're alive because the world needs people who are willing to stand for something," she said. "Not because you failed to stop a war you couldn't control. Not because you hesitated in a moment when hesitation was human. You're alive because you knocked on that door for me. Because you made a choice that nobody forced you to make. Because you decided that existing meant something worth fighting for." She kissed him then, and it was the first time they'd kissed without it being a performance for anyone's benefit. It was real in a way that felt almost dangerous, committing them to something neither of them could take back. The courthouse was a building of considerable importance, granite and marble and the weight of institutional authority. Sarah dressed carefully in the blue dress Marcus had bought her, pinned her hair precisely, prepared herself the way one prepares for battle. Marcus wore a suit that he'd purchased in Denver, clothes that made him look less like a rancher and more like someone who had business in a city, who had stakes in the systems that governed society. They arrived early, before the courtroom had filled. The judge's clerk was a thin man with spectacles who barely glanced at them as they entered. But as they were settling into their seats, Eleanor Pritchard arrived. She was dressed in her finest black dress, the one she wore to funerals and significant occasions, and she moved through the courtroom with the deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. She nodded to Marcus and Sarah but said nothing, taking a seat in the gallery behind them. Others began to arrive. Caroline Hess and her husband, several of the women who'd visited the ranch, a few shopkeepers and business owners from Silver Peak, and then, to Sarah's surprise, Jacob arrived, Marcus's young ranch hand. He was wearing clothes that were clearly borrowed, several sizes too large, but he sat down with his jaw set firm and his eyes fixed straight ahead. The judge entered, and everyone rose. His name was Thurston Kelly, and he was older, perhaps 70, with the lined face of someone who'd spent a lifetime making decisions that affected people's lives. He settled into his seat with the authority of someone accustomed to deference. A lawyer stood, someone Caroline must have hired, a man with sharp eyes and sharper words. He presented the marriage license to the judge, then called Caroline to the stand. She testified carefully, describing how she'd investigated the document, how she'd found inconsistencies, how she suspected fraud had been committed. She spoke about Sarah's background, about the bruises Sarah had displayed, about the suspicious timing of the marriage. She painted a picture of deception and manipulation, of an old man taking advantage of a vulnerable young woman, or alternatively, of a woman manipulating a wealthy man for access to his property. The judge listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When Caroline finished, the lawyer turned to Marcus. "You're free to make your statement, Mr. Thorne." Marcus stood. He didn't have a lawyer. He'd decided against hiring one, saying he didn't need legal representation to tell the truth. He walked to the front of the courtroom and raised his hand, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "The marriage license is forged," he said clearly. "I created it with the help of a clerk I paid to place it in the official record. Sarah Whitmore came to my ranch 3 months ago with severe injuries. She had been attacked by men in Silver Peak specifically because of her Apache heritage. I provided her shelter and protection. Several weeks later, when it became clear that the town intended to continue persecuting her, I forged the marriage license to provide her legal standing and protection." The judge set down his pen. "You're admitting to fraud?" "Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand the legal consequences of this admission?" "I do." The judge was quiet for a long moment. Then he gestured for Marcus to continue. "What I want you to understand," Marcus said, "is that the question before this court isn't whether the marriage license is real. We've established that it isn't. The question is whether Sarah Whitmore has the right to exist in Colorado without being persecuted, and whether I have the right to provide her shelter. Both of those answers are yes. Both of those answers are fundamental to what this country is supposed to be about." He paused, gathering his words. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend that forging the document was legal. It wasn't. But I am going to stand here and tell you that it was necessary. Because the alternative was to watch a young woman be hunted through the territories for the crime of having the wrong parents. And I couldn't do that." The lawyer stood to cross-examine, but he seemed uncertain. The admission of guilt had stolen his advantage. He tried to paint Marcus as a man who had exploited Sarah, but Marcus's testimony undercut that narrative. He'd provided shelter, not demanded anything in return, transferred property to Sarah to ensure her protection. Then Eleanor was called to testify. She spoke about Sarah's work at the general store, about her character, about the discrimination Sarah had faced. She spoke about Marcus, about his 20 years of respectable behavior, about his land and his standing. And then she said something that seemed to catch everyone by surprise. "What most people don't know," Eleanor said, looking directly at the judge, "is that Marcus had a sister, half Apache, like Sarah. And when society decided that she couldn't exist in the spaces we'd created, when they made her life impossible through discrimination and prejudice, She stopped fighting. She died, and Marcus has carried that guilt for 15 years. Eleanor's voice was steady, but thick with emotion. What he did with Sarah, forging a document, yes, but also standing for her, protecting her, refusing to abandon her when easier paths were available, he did because he understands what the alternative looks like. He understands what happens when good people do nothing, while cruelty is perpetrated against the innocent. The judge took the case under advisement. He said he would render his decision within a week. For the next 7 days, Marcus and Sarah remained in Denver waiting. They didn't leave the hotel much. They spent time reading, walking through the city's quieter streets, preparing themselves for whatever came next. On the 4th day, a message arrived from Eleanor, delivered by a boy who rode hard from Silver Peak. It said simply, "Sheriff Bradley has publicly stated he will not enforce any judgment against Marcus or Sarah. The town is divided." It was a small thing, but it mattered. On the 8th day, the judge issued his ruling. Marcus and Sarah went to the courthouse to hear it read aloud. The judge entered, papers in hand, and began to speak. The marriage license is, as has been established, fraudulent. The state of Colorado has an interest in maintaining the integrity of its legal documents. However, the judge paused, looking directly at Marcus. The state also has an interest in the rights of all its inhabitants to exist without persecution based on their heritage. He adjusted his spectacles. I find that while the forging of the marriage license was illegal, the underlying motivation, protecting a vulnerable person from persecution, falls into a category that the law, imperfect though it is, recognizes as potentially justified. Additionally, I find that the marriage, while created through fraudulent means, has been lived as genuine for a sufficient period that to dissolve it now would cause greater harm than allowing it to stand. The judge set down his papers. Therefore, I am ruling that the marriage between Marcus Thorne and Sarah Whitmore is legally valid and binding, despite the fraudulent document upon which it was based. Furthermore, I am ordering that the marriage license be corrected to reflect the actual date of the marriage, which I'm determining to be the date of the original, a fraudulent filing, but with a notation that it was filed with the understanding that both parties acknowledge its original creation was undertaken for protective purposes. He looked at Marcus. "Mr. Thorne, you will pay a fine of $500 for the forgery. Beyond that, I'm satisfied that justice has been served." The gavel came down, and in that sound, everything changed. The ride back to Silver Peak felt like moving through a different world than the one they'd left. The same mountains framed the horizon. The same snow blanketed the high country. The same wind moved through the pines with its familiar voice. But something fundamental had shifted in the spaces between things, in the way the world held them, in the way they held themselves. Marcus and Sarah didn't speak much during the journey. There was a quality of held breath to it, a sense that they were crossing back into territory that might not welcome them, that the judge's ruling, legally binding though it was, didn't guarantee acceptance or safety. They reached the ranch 2 days after leaving Denver. The house stood as they'd left it, smoke rising from the chimney where Marcus's ranch hands had kept the fire burning. But when Marcus and Sarah arrived, something was different about the way the men greeted them. Not welcoming exactly, but changed. More careful, more conscious that something had shifted in the town's relationship to the ranch. Jacob was the first to really greet them, running out to help with the horses, his young face split with a grin. "You won," he said simply. "The whole town's talking about it." The judge said the marriage was legal. "He did," Marcus confirmed, dismounting carefully. "But that doesn't mean everyone's happy about it." "No," Jacob agreed. "But it means something. It means they can't make you leave. It means—" He paused, struggling with words that might not exist in the vocabulary of a 14-year-old boy. "It means that what you did mattered. That night, as Marcus and Sarah settled back into the rhythm of the ranch, Eleanor arrived. She came on horseback, an old woman riding alone through high country that was growing darker with approaching evening. She looked smaller than she had in the courtroom, as if the journey had cost her something physical. But her eyes were clear, her purpose evident. Marcus helped her down from her horse, and Eleanor immediately asked to speak with both of them privately. In the kitchen, with coffee warming their hands, Eleanor delivered news that complicated the victory they'd won. "Caroline has decided to leave Silver Peak," Eleanor said without preamble. "She's taking her husband and their children back east. She says the town has become morally corrupt, and she can't raise her family here anymore." Marcus absorbed this without visible reaction, but Sarah could see the tightness around his eyes. "Is she alone in leaving?" he asked. "3 other families are going with her," Eleanor continued. "The ones who were most vocal in their support for her petition. The rest of the town, well, they're uncertain. Some are ashamed of how they treated you both. Some are angry that they didn't get the result they wanted. Some are simply trying to figure out what living in a place where Marcus Thorne is openly defiant means for their own stability." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "But there's something else you need to understand. The ruling was wise, but it was also unusual. Judge Kelly made a choice that could have gone the other way. And in some parts of Colorado, in some communities, there are people who see that choice as a threat to the natural order of things." "What kind of threat?" Sarah asked quietly. "The kind that doesn't always move through legal channels," Eleanor said carefully. "The kind that moves through violence when the law fails to deliver the result people want." Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out over his land in the gathering darkness. "You're saying they might come for us," he said. "It wasn't a question. I'm saying the fight isn't over just because the judge ruled in your favor," Eleanor replied. "The law protects you now, but the law also has limits. The law ends at the boundary of Silver Peak. Beyond that, in the territories, in the small settlements scattered through the mountains, there are men who don't recognize the judge's authority, who see what you've done as an abomination that needs correcting." She looked at Sarah directly. "There was a man asking questions in town last week, not from around here. He had the look of someone hired to do a specific job. He was showing people a drawing, a sketch of someone who looked very much like you. He was offering money for information about your location, your movements, your habits." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. The victory that had seemed so complete, so definitive, suddenly looked fragile. "Who was he?" Marcus asked, his voice hard. "No one could identify him. But Sheriff Bradley believes he was hired by someone with sufficient resources and sufficient rage. Caroline might be leaving, but her money is staying behind, invested in a very specific problem." Over the following weeks, Marcus began making preparations that were quiet but thorough. He hired 2 additional ranch hands, not locals, but men from Denver who came with recommendations and experience. He installed locks on the ranch house that were more sophisticated than the simple latches that had sufficed before. He began keeping the rifle close during the day and sleeping with it within arm's reach at night. Sarah, for her part, continued her weapons training with new intensity. The gun that had felt strange and heavy in her hands now felt like an extension of them. She learned not just how to shoot, but how to anticipate, how to read danger in the positioning of horses at a distance, how to understand the language that violence spoke before it actually arrived. They also began to leave the ranch more frequently, not out of bravado, but out of deliberate visibility. They went to town every Saturday, moving through Silver Peak streets with the same careful attention they'd shown before the court case. But now people's reactions were different. Some still looked away. But others, Eleanor, Sheriff Bradley, the storekeeper Mrs. Morrison, some of the younger people who hadn't yet, learned to fear what was different. They greeted Marcus and Sarah with something like respect. It was Eleanor who brought the next warning. She arrived on a afternoon in late January, her face grave, and asked to speak with Marcus alone. When she emerged from his study 20 minutes later, her exhaustion was visible. "There's been activity in the mountains," Eleanor told Sarah without preamble. "Men gathering, not local men, men with the look of professionals. Hired gun hands, Sarah, the kind who do work that's outside the law." How many? Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. Estimates range from 5 to maybe 12. Nobody's certain. They're moving through the territory north of here, staying away from town, away from anywhere the sheriff has jurisdiction. Eleanor sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. They're coming for you both. When exactly, nobody knows. But it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Marcus appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor didn't need to repeat what she'd told Sarah. He'd clearly heard from the other room. The judge's ruling bought us time, he said carefully. But it also marked us. There are people who see our victory as a problem that needs solving, and they're willing to pay for that solving. He looked at Sarah. We could leave. We could take what resources we have, leave the ranch, and disappear into a place where they can't find us. New Mexico, California, Canada, if we wanted to go that far. No, Sarah said immediately. This is your land. You've lived here for 20 years. You're not leaving because people can't accept that I exist. People are going to kill you, Eleanor said bluntly. Or try to. If you stay, you're accepting that possibility. I accepted that possibility the night I knocked on Marcus's door, Sarah replied. I've been accepting it every day since. Running doesn't change anything. It just means the next place will have the same problem, with different faces. She stood and walked to the window where she could see the ranch stretching out, the barns and corrals, and the vast open space that had become home. I'm staying, she said simply, and I'm ready for whatever comes. February arrived with a bite that seemed to carry more teeth than winter should possess. The work on the ranch continued, but it was different now. Every task undertaken with awareness, every movement conscious of potential danger. The hands Marcus had hired stayed alert, watching the perimeter, ready to signal if strangers approached. It was on a Thursday evening that Sheriff Bradley rode out to the ranch unexpectedly. He looked older than he had in Denver, worn down by responsibility and by the knowledge that the law had limits. I've decided something, he said without preamble, standing in Marcus's study. I'm resigning as sheriff. Marcus received this news without apparent shock, though Sarah could see surprise flicker in his eyes. Why? Marcus asked. Because I can't do the job I was hired to do if the job is limited to enforcing laws that only apply to people the town thinks deserve protection, Bradley said. I've spent my career trying to be fair, trying to apply the law equally. But I've learned that the law only has power when people accept it. And most of this territory has decided they don't accept a law that protects someone like Sarah. He looked directly at Marcus. I'm resigning because I'm tired of pretending I can maintain order here when the order itself is corrupt. And I'm resigning because my replacement will be someone more willing to look the other way when certain people do certain things. Who's replacing you? Marcus asked. A man named Harrison. He's been approved by the territorial government. He has no ties to Silver Peak, which everyone seems to think is an advantage. What it actually means is he has no investment in maintaining relationships, and he's more susceptible to being influenced by whoever has money and motivation to influence him. Bradley walked to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. I'm leaving tomorrow. I wanted to tell you before I go. I wanted you to understand that you're on your own now. The law won't protect you beyond what's written on paper. The sheriff won't come when you call. You need to be prepared for that. I am, Marcus said quietly. And I wanted to give you this, Bradley added, turning back and extending an envelope. It's a list. Names, descriptions, known associates of men who have been hired to do killing work in this territory. I've had my deputies compile it over months. If the men who come for you are professionals, they'll likely be on this list. It might help you understand what you're facing. He handed Marcus the envelope and extended his hand. I hope you survive this, Bradley said. Not just because it would be a tragedy if you didn't, but because someone needs to survive taking a stand for something. Someone needs to prove that you can do it and live. After the sheriff left, Marcus and Sarah opened the envelope and studied the list. The descriptions were sparse. Names, approximate ages, known weapons preferences, histories of previous jobs. But they painted a picture of professional violence, of men who did this work for money and had developed considerable skill at it. Sarah recognized none of the names, but that didn't matter. What mattered was understanding that the danger was real, specific and imminent. That night, as they lay in bed unable to sleep, Sarah reached over and took Marcus's hand in the darkness. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "So am I," Marcus replied. "But fear and courage are the same thing. Sarah, fear is just courage that hasn't decided what it's willing to sacrifice yet." Outside, the wind moved through the mountains, carrying the scent of snow and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, whether near or far, men were making their way toward the ranch, hired to solve a problem that wouldn't stay solved, employed to erase something that had decided it would not be erased. The court victory had been real. The marriage was legally valid. They had won something significant. But the world, it seemed, was not yet ready to accept what they'd won. And the real fight, the one that didn't happen in courtrooms, but in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, was still to come. The morning that came was ordinary in every way that mattered. The sun rose like it always did, casting long shadows across the ranch. The horses moved through their routines. The wind carried the scent of pine and open country. If there were signs that this day would be different from all the others, they were written in a language that only violence understands. Sarah woke before dawn, as she had for the past 2 weeks. She'd stopped sleeping deeply. Her body had learned to rest in a kind of readiness, muscles never fully relaxed, mind never quite distant from awareness. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb Marcus, and walked to the window. The north ridge was visible from their bedroom window, a long line of high ground that overlooked the ranch. That's where they would come from, she thought. If they were smart, they would use the terrain, position themselves where they could see everything while remaining unseen themselves. She was right. Marcus found her at the window and wrapped his arms around her from behind, neither of them speaking. Sometimes there was nothing left to say. There was only the knowledge of what was coming and the choice to meet it. Jacob came to the house at first light, moving quickly across the yard. He looked terrified, which was honest. A 14-year-old boy had no business being part of this, but his fear hadn't made him run. Marcus had offered him several times to leave, to go into town, to distance himself from the danger. Jacob had refused each time. "They're here," Jacob said, breathless. The hands spotted them about an hour ago, positioning themselves on the ridge and in the tree line to the east. "I counted at least 8 of them, maybe more." Marcus nodded once, as if he'd been expecting exactly this news at exactly this moment. Perhaps he had. "Get the horses saddled," he told Jacob. "Not for escape. Keep them in the corral. Load ammunition into every room of the house. The rifle stays with Sarah. I'll take the revolver." "What about me?" Jacob asked. "You stay here. Upstairs, in the back bedroom. You don't shoot unless someone comes through the house door. You understand? You stay alive. That's your only job." Over the next hour, they completed their preparations with the deliberation of people who understood that haste was its own kind of danger. Marcus boarded up the lower windows, leaving only narrow gaps for visibility and shooting. He positioned water and food supplies in the main room where they would make their stand. He tested every door lock twice. Sarah moved through the house like she'd been trained for this exact moment. She loaded rifles, checked ammunition, positioned weapons at strategic points. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. Whatever part of her was afraid had been compartmentalized, filed away, made irrelevant by the simple fact of necessity. They'd known this was coming. They'd prepared. Now it was here. The first shot came at noon. It came through the front window, missing everything except the glass, which exploded inward like an accusation. Marcus and Sarah both moved instinctively, backing away from the window, staying low. "They're testing," Marcus said. "Seeing how we respond, what our defensive positioning looks like." "How many?" Sarah asked. "From the shots I've heard, I'd estimate 6 of them positioned where they can actually see the house." Probably another 2 or 3 holding position further back, a voice came from outside, amplified by distance but clear enough to understand. Marcus Thorne, send out the Apache woman. Do that, and nobody else has to die. Marcus looked at Sarah, and she saw in his expression the calculation he was running, whether negotiation was possible, whether these were men who could be reasoned with, or if they were simply hired to do a job that only ended with blood. We're not negotiating, Marcus called back. She's my wife. She's staying where she is. Then people are going to start dying, the voice replied. What followed was gunfire. Not the careful, measured shots of the initial contact, but a barrage, multiple guns firing simultaneously, creating a thunder that seemed to shake the house itself. Bullets punched through the boarded windows, splintering wood, forcing Marcus and Sarah deeper into the house. The attack lasted maybe 3 minutes, though time became uncertain under the assault. When it stopped, the silence that followed was almost louder than the gunfire had been. Marcus checked his ammunition. He had perhaps 20 rounds for the revolver, maybe 30 for the rifles, if he was careful with rationing. The men outside had multiple weapons and likely unlimited ammunition. This wasn't a fight he could win through attrition. They're going to try to burn us out, Sarah said, understanding the strategy without needing it explained. Once they realize we're not going to come out, they'll set fires. They'll smoke us out or burn the house down. Probably, Marcus agreed. So we have maybe 2 hours before they do that, Sarah continued, unless they decide to try something else first. What they decided to try first was terror. They brought a horse forward, one of the Hans horses from some other ranch, and shot it in front of the house. The animal screamed, a sound that was almost human in its agony, and bled out slowly while Marcus and Sarah watched from their narrow window gaps. It was a message. It was a demonstration of what was possible. It was violence without purpose, except to say, we are willing to do terrible things. The message was received. After the horse stopped moving, one of the men shouted again, "Last chance, Thorne! Give us the girl, and you can walk away from this." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he took the rifle from its position and fired, not at the voice, but at where he estimated a man would be stationed to cover the approach to the house. The shot was good. The man screamed. The barrage resumed worse than before. It was vindictive now, angry, no longer professional. Bullets tore through the house, splintering furniture, shattering what remained of the glass, forcing them even deeper into the interior. But something had changed. With that first shot, Marcus had transformed the situation. He'd moved from victim to aggressor. The hired men were no longer simply executing a job. They were now fighting someone who was willing to fight back. The gunfire stopped. There was movement outside, visible in the gaps between the boards. They're moving closer, Sarah said, tracking the shadows. They're preparing to assault the house. How long? Marcus asked. Minutes. Maybe 5 minutes. Marcus made a decision then, the kind that changes everything. He set down his revolver and looked at Sarah directly. I'm going to give them a target, he said. I'm going to draw their fire while you move to the back of the house. There's an exit through the kitchen. I showed you where it is. You take the rifle, you go out through there, and you make your way to the ridge. You find high ground. No, Sarah said immediately. Yes, Marcus replied. Sarah, listen to me. They're focused on me. If you're alone, you can move. You can survive. But if we're both pinned down here, we both die. Then we both die, Sarah said. Because I'm not leaving you. Marcus grabbed her shoulders, and she could see in his eyes the desperation of someone trying to save someone they love. My sister died because she was alone, he said fiercely. She died because there was nobody standing with her. I'm not going to be the reason you die alone. I'm not going to carry that weight. And I'm not going to survive by running while you hold them off, Sarah countered. That's not how this ends, Marcus. We stand together or we don't stand at all. For a moment they were locked in a standoff of their own, neither willing to yield. Then the front door exploded inward. The men came through like a tide. 6 of them, guns raised, fury in their eyes. Marcus grabbed the rifle and fired before they could fully cross the threshold. One man went down. Another was hit but kept coming. The sound was deafening, the violence immediate and total. Sarah fired from her position, accounting for a second man. But there were too many, and the men outside were using the assault as cover, pushing in from multiple angles. Marcus was hit, a shot that caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell, and Sarah saw red spreading across his shirt, and something broke inside her. Some final restraint that had held her in place. She moved without thinking, without strategy, moved with the pure animal response of something that sees its pack member go down. She fired the rifle without aiming, just creating noise and chaos, buying seconds. She moved toward Marcus, pulling him back away from the door, toward the deeper parts of the house. One of the men reached for her, and she swung the rifle like a club, connecting with his skull, feeling bone give way, understanding in that moment what it meant to be capable of violence. But she was one person, and they were many. It was the sound from outside that saved them, gunfire from a new direction, shots coming from the ridge, from the trees, from positions that shouldn't have had anyone in them. And with those shots came a sound that made the hired men pause in their assault. Silver Peak. "Everyone stand down." It was Eleanor's voice, Eleanor Pritchard, who'd spent her life being respectable, who'd spent her life not causing trouble, had ridden out to the ranch with Sheriff Bradley and every able-bodied person in Silver Peak who was willing to stand with Marcus and Sarah. They'd positioned themselves in the high ground, and they were firing on the hired men with a coordination that suggested they'd planned this intervention. The dynamics shifted instantly. The men who'd been pressing into the house suddenly found themselves under fire from multiple positions. One of them was hit, then another. The assault collapsed into chaos. Men ran for their horses, abandoning the house, abandoning the plan, realizing that what had seemed like a straightforward killing had transformed into a battle they couldn't win. Within minutes, they were gone, riding hard away from the ranch, leaving behind their wounded and their dead, and the knowledge that they'd failed. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear nothing except her own breathing and Marcus's shallow, pained breath beside her. Eleanor appeared at what remained of the front door, perhaps 5 minutes after the hired men had disappeared. She was dusty, her dress torn, her face flushed with exertion and adrenaline. Behind her was Sheriff Bradley, both hands bleeding. And behind him were people Sarah recognized from Silver Peak, merchants and ranchers, town people who'd decided to stand. "Help me with him," Sarah said. Kneeling beside Marcus, Eleanor was already there, examining his wound with a practicality that suggested she'd dealt with gunshot injuries before. "The bullet went through," Eleanor said. "Missed anything vital? He's going to be in considerable pain, but he's going to live. Why did you come?" Sarah asked, looking up at the older woman. "Because," Eleanor said simply, "I'm tired of standing on the sidelines while cruelty wins. Because Marcus was right to do what he did. Because you deserve to exist. And because sometimes the only thing that stops injustice is people deciding that they're not going to accept it anymore." Sheriff Bradley knelt down beside them. The men who came here were professional gun hands hired by Caroline Hess before. "She left town," he explained. "She paid them $500 to kill you both. I found the contract in the Stagecoach Company's records after I realized what was happening." He paused. "I also found out that the territorial government isn't happy about what happened here. They're considering sending marshals to investigate. There's talk of this becoming something bigger than local politics. What does that mean?" Marcus asked, wincing with pain as he tried to move. "It means," Bradley said carefully, "that what started as a local conflict has caught the attention of people with actual authority, and those people have decided they need to investigate whether the judge's ruling was legitimate and whether you've been operating within the law." Marcus tried to sit up, failed, fell back. "Will they overturn the ruling?" "No," Bradley said, "because the judge is respected. And because the evidence of what happened here today shows what happens when people refuse to accept legal authority. The territorial government isn't interested in supporting that kind of rebellion. They want stability And what you and Sarah have demonstrated is that trying to overturn your marriage legally is going to cause instability. Eleanor helped Sarah get water for Marcus, helped bind his wound with cloth torn from sheets. As they worked, people moved through the ranch house, assessing damage, beginning the work of restoration. Jacob emerged from upstairs, eyes wide but unharmed. He immediately began helping with the cleanup, moving through the space with the particular dignity of someone who'd been tested and had not broken. That evening, as the sun set and the ranch settled into an exhausted quiet, Marcus and Sarah sat on the porch together. Eleanor had left to return to town, taking most of the others with her. Sheriff Bradley remained, sleeping in the guest room, saying he wanted to be present in case there were complications or additional threats. "It's over," Sarah said quietly. "This part is," Marcus corrected, "but there will be other parts, other places, other people who can't accept that you exist as you are." "I know," Sarah replied, "but they couldn't kill us. They couldn't silence us. And they couldn't make me disappear." She took Marcus's uninjured hand. "That matters," she said. "I know it's not a complete victory. I know there are people in Silver Peak and beyond who still hate what we represent. But today we survived. Today people stood with us. Today the law held, and the people who tried to break it lost." Marcus looked out over his ranch, at the land he'd owned for 20 years, at the house that had become home to both of them, at the space where they'd chosen to make their stand. "My sister asked me once," he said quietly, "why I bothered living when I'd failed to stop the cruelty I saw. I never had a good answer for her." He turned to look at Sarah. "But I think I have one now. We live because living itself is a kind of victory. We exist because existing is what they're trying to prevent. We stand here, on this land, in this marriage that shouldn't be possible according to the world's logic. And we prove that their version of the world is incomplete." He squeezed her hand gently. "We live because someone has to. Someone has to show that it's possible to stand for something and survive. Someone has to be proof that the world can change. However slowly, however painfully." In the distance, a coyote called out to the darkness, and Sarah recognized the sound now not as a symbol of danger, but as a voice belonging to something wild and free, something that couldn't be contained by the categories people tried to impose on it. "Come spring," Sarah said, "I want to plant a garden." Marcus looked at her, surprised, then smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the shooting began. "A garden," he repeated. "Yes, with vegetables and flowers. Things that grow, things that are beautiful just for being alive." "That sounds like the most revolutionary thing I've heard all day," Marcus said, and as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, as the silence of the frontier settled around them, Marcus and Sarah sat together on the porch of their ranch, a giant rancher and the Apache woman he'd chosen to protect, bound together not by deception but by something real, something that had been tested in fire and had not broken. Behind them, the house stood solid against the darkness, windows still broken, walls still marked by bullets, but standing nonetheless, a monument to the cost of standing for something, a testimony to what it meant to refuse to disappear. And far away in Silver Peak, Eleanor Pritchard sat in her store and thought about the life she'd lived in the margins, the choices she hadn't made, the people she hadn't stood for. She thought about her brother's sister, Eleanor, who died from the weight of too much loneliness. And she thought about Sarah and Marcus, who'd survived by choosing each other, by choosing to be seen, by choosing to exist despite everything. Eleanor pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. She was writing a letter to the territorial governor, a statement about what had happened, a documentation of the events that had led to the violence. But more than that, she was writing a story, the story of a woman with Apache blood and a man with nothing to lose, and how they'd changed the landscape of a small Colorado town just by refusing to disappear. It was a small story in the grand scheme of things. But small stories, when they're true, when they're lived with conviction, sometimes become the ones that matter most. Sometimes they're the ones that ripple outward and change other small stories until eventually the whole narrative shifts. The story of Sarah and Marcus would do that. Not immediately, not completely. But it would become a story that people told about the rancher who'd stood for someone the town wanted to destroy, about the woman who'd refused to be erased, about what happened when people decided that survival wasn't enough, that they needed to live, and in the high country of Colorado, in the wind that moved through the pines, in the vast open spaces that had held indigenous peoples for centuries before any of this. The land itself bore witness to what had happened. The land, indifferent to human categories and human hatreds, simply continued being beautiful, vast, and free, just as Sarah Thorne would continue being Apache and white, loved and hated, visible and defiant, alive in a way that couldn't be quantified or categorized or made respectable. She was alive because she'd decided to be. She was loved because someone had decided to stand for her. She was home because she'd refused to run, and that, in the end, was everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.